In Genoa City, storms don't always come with thunder and lightning. Sometimes, they begin with a secret from the past, a broken heart, and a truth powerful enough to destroy everything. This week on The Young and the Restless, Audra Charles's world unravels in ways no one expected. Welcome back. Young and the Restless spoilers reveal Audra's horrific past. A girl who grew up emotionally deprived while living with an irresponsible father. But this week's Audra Charles tornado really blew away any remaining illusions. The woman who once climbed to the top with speed and boldness that made the entire business world wary is now standing on the edge of a precipice where past secrets are exposed like irreparable cracks. Victor Newman's seduction scheme to test and even control Audra eventually collapses in a way that exposes both sides of power, the power to control others and the price of treating people's hearts as pawns on a chessboard. Nate Hastings, the man Audra believed could be both a partner and a spiritual anchor, abruptly ends the relationship. At that moment, Holden Novak from Los Angeles emerges like a ghost from the past, armed with evidence that threatens to expose her past illegal activities. And as if that weren't enough, the tragedy deepens with a revelation that numbs the senses. The truth about Noah Newman's death, a dark chapter thought buried, is brought back to life. To understand why Audra has always raced toward the top like a hunted woman, it's necessary to look beyond her cold shell. Audra's childhood was not filled with warm dinners or gentle teachings. It was filled with the strong smell of alcohol on her alcoholic father's shirt and the constant absences of her mother. In a small, dimly lit apartment, she learned to read people's expressions to survive, to turn silence into a wall and ambition into armor. The notion that marriage is dead is not just a wild statement, but an equation for survival. When those who were supposed to love her abandoned her, bondage became handcuffs. And freedom, even when alone, became the only thing that could be controlled. That was the beginning of her ultimate thirst for power. Power that promised safety, power that meant no one could hurt her again. In the cutthroat environment of Los Angeles, where every deal was a gamble, Audra met Holden Novak. It was a strategic alliance at first. He provided shortcuts. She provided intelligence, recklessness, and a burgeoning network of connections. But shortcuts rarely led to safety. Dark activities, from manipulating data to laundering opaque funds to hand-to-hand deals that eluded scrutiny, gradually created a system of vines that wrapped tightly around Audra's career. In that maze, a romance with Noah Newman sprouted like a rare ray of light. They had a child together, or rather, the dream of a child that fate had snatched away in a seemingly peaceful moment. The loss froze Audra's softest part, causing her to push love away, pouring her energy into power as a way to make up for what life had taken away. But the tragedy was not over. The fragments that Holden holds on to eventually form a complete picture of a fateful night involving Noah. That night, he says, was the culmination of a series of tensions between Audra and her network of partners in LA. A phone call, a suburban rendezvous, a deal to be arranged, and a car going out of control in a rare western rainstorm. All of it took only a few minutes, but felt like a lifetime. Noah left with a trail of blood and a phone that never turned back on. Although the official reports state it was an accident, Holden has in his possession facts that suggest a more complicated truth. Who called Noah there? Who moved some of the evidence from the scene? And why did a sum of money flow into an intermediary account that very night? In Genoa City, that threat is enough to turn the past into a dagger hanging over Audra's head. In that context, Victor's trial-by-fire plan falls apart. Despite his history of turning opponents into pawns, Audra is not one to be swayed by promises. She strikes back using the very cracks in Victor's game plan to escape his sleek cage. But that tactical victory does not save her from strategic defeat. Victor only needs to fail the right way to expose Audra's true self to those she most desires to keep. Nate witnesses it all and makes the cold decision to distance himself from the eye of the storm before he is sucked into its destructive orbit. His decisiveness is more than a moral response. It is the reflex of a doctor who knows when to cut away the necrosis to save the rest. Audra's career, built on quick wins, is starting to fray. Investment partners see a reputational credit risk. Political allies smell an investigation. Opponents are waiting for a cleanup to take their seats. The hallways she once confidently walked through have become narrow alleys where suspicious eyes line up like warning lights. Strangely, this is also where Audra's true self comes into focus. She doesn't beg. She does what she always does: plan. But the big difference this time is that the goal of the plan is no longer a seat or a title, but survival in the most radical sense. How to fend off Holden's attacks, silence the opportunists, and most importantly, how to say goodbye properly to the Noah she once tried to forget. Revisiting Noah's tragedy doesn't just knock down Audra's walls. It shakes the circles around her. Sharon and Nick will be forced to confront the question: how much of the truth has been buried by time, pain, and convenience? The hazy traces of LA suddenly have names, moments, and witnesses. Each new piece of the puzzle reveals not only more pain, but also a need for justice. Why does this private story shine such a clear light on Audra's public choice? Because power has never been a pastime for her. It's an immune system. When the child is gone, when Noah is gone, Audra learns that everything can be taken away overnight if you don't take control. The old-fashioned marriage manifesto is thus a shield. If you don't put your trust in the form of bondage, you won't be crushed when it collapses. If position can buy security, the moral trade-off is sometimes a tax. Only now, as secrets are pulled into the light, does Audra see the paradox. The power she held on to as a lifeline has pushed her farther from the only shore that could save her, the truth. When Nate turns, the space beside Audra is loud. It reminds her that every strategic ally has an expiration date if it's based on fear. Her fall from grace with Victor shows that she underestimated the sophistication of the Newman tests. And Holden, with his clear goal of turning secrets into currency, forces her to choose between confessing or escalating the price. In a city where apologies often come last, Audra may be approaching a rare moment when she can rewrite the rules of the game. She can proactively expose the crucial truth: the rainy night in LA, the things she did and didn't do, before Holden can sell them on the underground table. Meanwhile, the Genoa City power ecosystem adjusts its telescope. Victor, who never accepts a flaw he can't turn into an opportunity, will restructure the human matrix around communications and investing to minimize Audra's risk. Chancellor Winters smells blood, ready to fill the strategic void with cleaner faces. Names that have touched Audra, like Kyle and even Victoria, will reconsider their positions. On the new board, Audra is no longer the active attacker. She is the cornered queen, forced to calculate her sacrifice. What to sacrifice, to whom, and what to sacrifice for. What makes this story different from the other times Audra has dodged the axe is the material: real tragedy, real loss, and guilt that cannot be washed away by a successful business deal. If she chooses to remain silent, Holden will speak for her. If she chooses to fight with cunning, Victor will respond with the rules he knows by heart. If she chooses to run, the pain will catch up. So, the least expected path is the most likely. Audra confronts the situation publicly, chooses her own stage and time, gives back her true name for Noah's death, admits her share of responsibility, even if it's only moral responsibility, and reclaims from herself the right to live without the armor of power that constricts her heart. As night falls on the windows of Genoa City's offices, a different Audra is emerging, less bound to the illusion of control, more courageous in accepting vulnerability as part of healing. The simultaneous collapse of Victor's plan, Nate's relationship, Holden's threat, and the truth about Noah have created the perfect storm. But the storm could also be a cleansing ritual. If Audra truly dares to step forward, her story will no longer be a saga of advancement at all costs, but a rare journey in the world of power, using the truth as a new foundation. Then the question of whether marriage is obsolete will no longer matter as much as the question: do you still believe that some bond, to the truth, to your conscience, to the memory of Noah, is strong enough to lead you out of the maze? Audra Charles has often angered audiences with her coldness. However, after these revelations, her emotions become more complicated. Both anger at her wrong choices and grief at the root of what made her who she is today. And that's the appeal of the story. No one is entirely victim or perpetrator. Everyone is grappling with old wounds in a city where power demands tribute. This time, Audra's highest price may not be titles or contracts, but learning to put her heart on the table, taking the biggest risk in exchange for the only chance at true freedom. Not all storms come from acquisitions or boardroom confrontations. Sometimes, the eye of the storm begins with a seemingly simple confession. When Audra Charles sits across from Nikki Newman and calmly admits her father's alcoholism, her mother's absence, her ambitions, her bold moves, her habit of negotiating the thin line between risk and deception, there's a new map to read. It's not an attempt at self-justification. It's a cold description of a survival mechanism that has nurtured her in the dark. When home is no longer a safe place, power is armor, money is a necessity, and control, however fragile, is oxygen. Growing up with the clanking of liquor bottles, weeks without a mother, Audra learned to read the room before it read her. She learned to measure the distance between words and intentions, between smiles and schemes, between promises and traps. For other children, ambition was a ticket to the top. For Audra, ambition was the tissue of survival. Power was not a destination to be boasted about, but the only immune system she could rely on against an inherently unpredictable world. So when others saw a woman as greedy, she saw receipts for sleepless nights. When others accused her of being cold, she remembered how many times she had to swallow her fear to stand tall. That worldview explains why Audra's every decision revolved around two axes, safety and control. Ironically, her thirst for control drove her into another form of dependence, the most expensive dependence in finance, dependence on the ecosystem of powerful men. It wasn't just a feeling. It showed up on the balance sheet. When she needed assets and leverage to get into the game, Audra turned to Tucker McCall, a veteran of the art of turning chaos into a bargaining chip. When she needed capital and a large-scale umbrella for Glacade, she turned to Victor Newman, a man who understood the value of every dollar he poured in and the veto power behind every term. When she built the Bronte herself, the name sounded like a declaration of independence, but it turned out to be tied to Victor's financial infusion. The seemingly generous term sheets included milestone funding provisions, veto rights on strategic deals, and even the right to change key personnel in the event of a material risk. Each deposit thus became a string, soft but unbreakable, that kept V. Bronte in Newman's orbit. Audra had an office, a team, and a logo in the press, but the foundation was still someone else's money and someone else's rules. Why couldn't she build an independent platform? The reason is not just fundraising or networking. The root is psychological. For someone who has been let down too many times, the endorsement of a big name is like a safety lock. But endorsements are like any sedative. If used too long, they lose their ability to self-regulate. Audra builds companies like scaffolding. The higher the scaffolding, the grander the building seems, until someone pulls the plug. A phone call from Tucker can change project priorities. A fit from Victor can slow cash flow and send alarm bells ringing. When your power is not based on the assets, technology, or distribution channels you control, but on the goodwill of someone more powerful, that power is essentially borrowing power. Audra's sharing of her story with Nikki is thus both a confession and a cry for help. Nikki, who has battled alcohol and her own mistakes, sees a distorted but honest reflection of herself in Audra. Nikki understands the difference between blaming the past and explaining why you're the person you are today. And only Nikki has the authority and empathy to draw a clear line. If Audra's troubled childhood has led her to use power as armor, it's time for her to learn a different kind of courage. The courage to build a foundation, not just win a seat. Instead of continuing to juggle Tucker and Victor, Audra needs a structure that will free her from the manipulation of any single sponsor. In fact, this problem has a very specific solution. First, recapitalize V. Bronte. Replace the single dominant sponsor model with a diversified capital structure, bringing growth funds and one or two strategic investors with expertise in the company's core business. Second, establish a truly independent board, at least 2 independent directors with veto power over related party transactions so that no backroom phone call can steer the company in an emotional direction. Third, lock and risk management. Review all contracts signed with Glacade, Newman Enterprises, and Tucker-related entities. Disclose affected terms to the board to avoid backdoor deals. Fourth, build core competencies that money can't buy overnight: product teams, customer pipelines, technical alliances, which will keep Vibrante afloat even when funding slows. Finally, a crisis communications plan. Tell your story honestly and in a controlled way so that partners and employees understand why the company needs to change. It's a technocratic path. But to get there, Audra needs to shed some of the armor that has saved her for years. She has to learn to tolerate uncertainty without immediately reaching for an iron fist. She has to accept going slower, losing some immediate privileges in exchange for long-term stability. On an emotional level, that means opening up space for trust with her team, with the process, with herself. Audra used to win by reflexively carrying the day. Now, the right strategy might be to delegate, to build a team strong enough that one mistake doesn't bring the whole system down. Meanwhile, Victor and Tucker aren't standing still. Victor sees every dislocation as an opportunity to reposition his influence. If Vibrante seeks to reduce dependence, he will either raise the ceiling of support to tie it more tightly, or he will actively withdraw and apply pressure on the market to test Audra's endurance. Tucker, instinctively as always, will probe the undercurrent, offering a quick fix, a deal, an alliance, a commitment wrapped in the language Audra knows: speed, momentum, and short-term wins. Audra's choice is thus not just a financial one. It is a test of whether she dares to reject the instincts that have saved her in order to follow a new rhythm. Significantly, the confession to Nikki has quietly changed the way others read Audra. When the root causes are called by their proper names, people may not forgive her schemes, but at least understand where they come from. Understanding does not absolve guilt. It creates the soil for responsibility to germinate. If Audra continues to use her past as a shield of immunity, she will lose the only opportunity that honesty opens up. But if she uses it as a springboard for change, starting with concrete steps like ending toxic terms, making money transparent, and bringing in independence, then the image of the cold opportunist can give way to the hard-nosed executive who fixes things. Ultimately, Audra's story is a beautiful and cruel paradox. A person who uses power to protect her most vulnerable self. But the more she protects it, the more it is stifled. She wants control because she was abandoned. But the more she tries to control, the more she becomes dependent on those who can take it away from her with a snap. The cycle stops only when she dares to choose a different kind of security. A security based on real foundations, corporate structure, financial discipline, and an identity that doesn't need the name of any powerful man to define it. Genoa City will continue to buzz with new battles. But if you look closely, you'll see a quieter journey at the edges where Audra Charles learns to walk on her own 2 feet. It's a journey with less fireworks, more sweat. Less sensational page-turning, more boring repetitions of management and self-discipline. It doesn't promise immediate glory. But if she's patient, one day people will talk about Vibrante as a living entity of its own, no longer Newman's satellite or Tucker's project. And then perhaps Audra won't need to recount her childhood as an explanation. It will settle into place, a harsh opening chapter leading to a coming-of-age story that's calm enough to not need armor when walking into a meeting.